Hi, I'm Larry Becker, and in this video, we're going to show you how to use a consumer type camera, we call these point and shoot cameras, to take better pictures indoors and in low light by knowing a few techniques and understanding your camera just a little bit better. This time of year, people start thinking about family gatherings and capturing memories. And one of the best ways to do that is with pictures from holiday dinners and get-togethers. But so many times when you look back over the shots you took, there are lots of blurry shots and images with bad color tints. And you find yourself wishing you had better pictures. Well, before you blame your camera, there are some things you can do to improve your chances for capturing great images, and that's what this video is all about. So let's start by looking at things that make pictures bad. There's harsh flash, low light photos that capture blurred motion. And that's different from images that are blurry even without motion because the focus was off. And then there are those that just have bad composition and pictures where things have a bad color cast. And don't forget red eye. If we understand the limitations of our cameras and the factors that make these flaws show up in our images, we can do simple things to overcome those limitations. And here's a hint, almost all these bad results come from insufficient light. When there isn't enough light, in many cases, the camera determines that you need to add flash. So the flash fires, and that's almost never a good thing. Why is that? Well, consider the characteristics of the light source. Whenever you have a small, bright light source, you'll get harsh shadows and overly bright highlight areas. The sun is a perfect example of this. Whenever you stand outside in direct sunshine, you have hard shadows and a dramatic difference between the bright areas and the shadow areas of your image. And while the sun may be a very large thing, well, relative to standing outside in a field, the sun is a small bright spot in the sky. But then when a cloud comes between you and the sun, all those harsh shadows and bright highlights get much softer. And the result is a much smoother transition between highlight and shadow. So if a flash on a camera is like the sun, think about what you could do to spread the light out much more evenly like a cloud does. One thing professional photographers do is they point their flash toward a wall or the ceiling instead of straight at their subject. So instead of having a small shiny light source, the entire ceiling or the entire wall becomes your light source. Granted, it's not as bright as the direct flash would be, but that spread of light softens the highlights and shadows, and pictures almost always turn out better. If you have a point and shoot that's packed with all kinds of pro features, like this Canon PowerShot G15, you may find that you have both a pop-up flash and a hot shoe, so you could plug in an even more powerful flash. And lots of those have articulated flash heads that can be pointed in any direction you want. However, since most point-and-shoot cameras, like this Nikon Coolpix P310 or this Sony CyberShot DSC W690, have a fixed flash that can't be pointed toward the ceiling, you could hold an index card or a folded sheet of paper in front of the flash at an angle and then bounce the light toward the ceiling or a wall, and as the photographer, you're going to feel like you look a little bit silly until you see the finished images. Depending on the shape of your camera and where your flash is located, you might try to rig some sort of origami project out of an index card and then secure it with a little piece of tape. Again, it might look a little goofy, but the resulting pictures will almost always be much better. And another side benefit of this is that it eliminates the possibility of red eye. That's because red eye comes from a very bright flash being very close to the same place as your lens. Bouncing your light to make your light source come from somewhere else fixes the problem automatically. Another makeshift solution many photographers use is a white paper napkin. If you hold it in front of the flash, someplace where it won't show up in your picture, but someplace that keeps the harsh direct flash from hitting your subject, then the napkin does the same thing as the cloud does when it gets in front of the sun. It diffuses the light and spreads it out. Professional photographers have all kinds of light diffusers, and almost any time someone new to photography starts adding gear to their camera bag, a diffuser and a reflector are high on their list. Now, let's assume that you don't want to worry about that direct, harsh light, so you decide you're going to turn off your flash entirely. Well, lots of times this is a good solution, but indoors around the dinner table, there are lots of times when there isn't sufficient light for your camera to capture a sharp image. Here's why. The image sensor inside digital cameras needs a certain amount of light in order to capture an image. There are three things that factor into your camera's ability to capture an image. First, how fast the shutter opens and closes. That's called shutter speed. Second, how wide the shutter opens, and that's called aperture. And third, how sensitive the image sensor is to light, and this is referred to as ISO. Now, on most cameras, you have the ability to control most of these settings, but there's always going to be a trade-off. For example, as you increase your ISO, the amount of digital noise, and I want you to think of that as visual static, in your images will increase. So if your camera has a very high ISO setting, you'll be able to capture images in lower light, but they might be a bit fuzzy. Another possibility is to have your camera open the shutter as wide as possible to let in the maximum amount of light. Unfortunately, some point-and-shoot cameras don't have very wide aperture options. Even if you do have a point-and-shoot camera with a very wide aperture available, for example, the Canon G15 and the Nikon P310 have an f1.8 wide aperture available on the widest end of the zoom, and that's pretty impressive for a point-and-shoot. Wide aperture photography can cause a lot of your image to be out of focus and only a very shallow plane to be in focus. So if you're taking a photograph of several people and they aren't exactly the same distance from the camera, a wide aperture photograph could cause some of the people to be a bit out of focus. Most point-and-shoot cameras have auto ISO, and the good news is that even if the camera boosts the ISO number to a high setting, and your images turn out a little bit noisy, at least you have a picture you can see. If your camera allows for manual ISO settings, you should probably do some experimenting beforehand to see what the highest ISO setting is that still captures usable images. This won't necessarily be the same number from one camera to the next, so one camera might capture usable images at 3200 ISO, while another camera might not capture anything usable over 800 ISO. I don't want you to get all caught up in these settings and numbers though. You just need to be aware that if you can adjust your ISO setting manually, it will be helpful to know what the maximum setting is on your camera that still delivers acceptable quality. So it might seem like we're back to using a flash, but consider other light sources that are available too. For example, if there are several lamps in the room where you're taking pictures, turn all the lights on. And if you're taking posed photographs of family members, consider taking the lampshades off for a little while. Anything to increase the amount of light available is going to improve your photographs. Another way your camera could compensate for low light is to leave the shutter open longer. The Nikon P310 and the Canon G15 have shutter priority settings, meaning the camera lets you control the shutter speed. A slower shutter speed, like 1/30th of a second or slower, will definitely let in more light, but any motion at all will tend to blur in these images. And even the steadiest hand will blur images shot at these slower speeds. You'll just need to experiment and see what balance of slow shutter speed works and still freezes the action. But depending on your camera, the blur introduced by handshake might not happen until your shutter speed is quite slow. These days, a lot of cameras have image stabilization or vibration reduction built into the camera, and all three of our example cameras do. If yours does, make sure to always leave it turned on because this will minimize any shake coming from your hands. Another thing that you can do is tuck your elbows in tight against your body and then stand with your feet at least shoulder width apart. The key is to find a position where you're as steady as possible holding your camera. If you can put your elbows on a table or a counter, that's even better. Professional photographers often use tripods so that they isolate their camera from any vibration or shake at all. This allows them to capture sharper images, and you can do the exact same thing. And you don't even need a big expensive tripod to get started. Something like a small tabletop tripod, like this one from Oben, can help you hold your camera much steadier. Another option might be a Joby Gorilla Pod, and this can be used on all kinds of surfaces like tree branches, chair backs, and of course flat surfaces like this. So a tripod will almost always hold your camera far steadier than you ever could with your hands. But there's another trick to capturing even sharper images. Use your camera's built-in timer so that after you press the shutter button, your camera has a second or two to stop shaking. And then when the picture gets taken, nobody's even touching the camera. You can't get any steadier than that. Another trick for capturing good images is to use your camera's burst mode if it has one. If you can change a setting on your camera and simply hold down the shutter button while your camera takes picture after picture, you have a much better chance of capturing at least a few good images out of each bunch. Granted, you may find yourself weeding through lots of images when you're done taking pictures, but at least you'll have some good ones in the mix. The way that digital cameras work, when you press the shutter button halfway down, the camera does its best to capture focus. If you're in a really low light situation, you may have too little light in order to capture the focus in the first place. So even if you get your subjects to hold perfectly still and you take a timed photograph using a tripod, if your camera can't capture focus in the first place, your images are gonna be out of focus. That's one of the times where I recommend using a small flashlight. Even a keychain flashlight temporarily pointed at your subject can give your camera enough light to capture focus and then shoot a good image. When it comes to your images having an incorrect color cast, there's a setting you should look into on your camera called white balance. Normally, auto white balance works just fine, but in low light situations, your camera's light sensors might guess the color of the light incorrectly. If you just familiarize yourself with the available white balance options and set your camera for the kind of light you're shooting in, that can make a world of difference. For example, in most homes with incandescent light, simply setting your white balance to incandescent will compensate for that extra reddish tint that comes from those kinds of lights, and your pictures will look better. When you go into the kitchen, there's fluorescent light. Remember to flip the setting to fluorescent. All of our sample point-and-shoot cameras have this feature, and yours probably does too. Just a quick note about composition. Shooting images when your camera is set on the wide end of the zoom will usually allow you the added benefit of being able to crop the image on your computer and create a more appealing image. Placing your main subject off-center usually makes those images more appealing. But there's one other thing to keep in mind. If you're close to somebody and you shoot their picture with the lens set at the wide end, that will have a tendency to distort that person's face. But if you step back a little and zoom in, it will remove that wide-angle lens distortion, and your subject will look much more normal and in proportion. One last piece of photographic gear I'd like to mention is a reflector. Frequently, you'll be in a situation where there's much more light behind your subject than in front, and using a reflector to bounce some of the available light back at your subject can give you enough light to capture a much better picture. A reflector might be something as simple as a sheet of paper, but if you're willing to invest $20 or $30, you can get a great collapsible professional reflector that folds down to a convenient size for travel, but it pops open and then it helps you in a surprising number of ways. For example, the most commonly available kind of reflector is a 5-in-1 reflector. It has a shiny silver surface for reflecting as much light as possible. It has a gold surface for warming up the light that you bounce back toward your subject, a white surface for bouncing a little bit less light and a softer light than the silver surface, and a couple of other options depending on which reflector you buy. And if you buy a model which has a translucent white panel in the center, you can diffuse your flash and bounce it all at the same time. Now, if all this is new to you and it seems a little bit overwhelming, don't worry about it. Just realize that if you look at your LCD and there's something wrong with the picture you just shot, there are solutions. And you'll probably be surprised that just knowing these things helps you improve your pictures right away. When you see red eye or harsh flash, you'll know you should diffuse or bounce your flash. If things are blurred in low light, you'll know you should steady your camera or increase your camera's sensitivity to light. And now that you're aware how important it is to get more light into your images, you'll be thinking about turning on all those lights and taking off lampshades. See, you already know more about improving low light pictures with a point and shoot than you thought. And I bet if you come back and watch this video again in a couple of months, you'll be amazed how much better you've become as a photographer because you know what to do now. From the folks here at Kelby Training and B&H, we hope you create even brighter memories and pictures that make you smile. I'm Larry Becker. Thanks for watching.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.